This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For further information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Andy Minter. 4 Max Carrados Detective Stories by Ernest Bramah. 3. The Tragedy at Brookbend Cottage. "Max," said Mr. Carlyle, when Parkinson had closed the door behind him, "this is Lieutenant Hollyer, whom you consented to see." "To hear?" "To hear," corrected Carrados, smiling straight into the healthy and rather embarrassed face of the stranger before him. "Mr. Hollyer knows of my disability?" "Mr. Carlyle told me," said the young man. "But as a matter of fact I had heard of you before, Mr. Carrados, from one of our men. It was in connection with the foundering of the Ivan Saratov." Carrados wagged his head in good humoured resignation. "And the owners were sworn to inviolable secrecy!" he exclaimed. "Well, it is inevitable, I suppose. Not another scuttling case, Mr. Hollyer?" "No, mine is quite a private matter," replied the lieutenant. "My sister, Mrs. Creake but Mr. Carlyle would tell you better than I can. He knows all about it." "No, no. Carlyle is a professional. Let me have it in the rough, Mr. Hollyer. My ears are my eyes, you know." "Very well, sir. I can tell you what there is to tell, right enough. But I feel that when all's said and done it must sound very little to another, although it seems important to me." "We have occasionally found trifles of significance ourselves," said Carrados encouragingly. "Don't let that deter you." This was the essence of Lieutenant Hollyer's narrative. "I have a sister, Millicent, who is married to a man called Creake. She is about 28 now and he is at least 15 years older. Neither my mother, who has since died, nor I cared very much about Creake. We had nothing particular against him, except perhaps the moderate disparity of age, but none of us appeared to have anything in common. He was a dark, taciturn man and his moody silence froze up conversation. As a result, of course, we didn't see much of each other." "This, you must understand, was 4 or 5 years ago, Max," interposed Mr. Carlyle officiously. Carrados maintained an uncompromising silence. Mr. Carlyle blew his nose and contrived to impart a hurt significance into the operation. Then Lieutenant Hollyer continued. "Millicent married Creake after a very short engagement. It was a frightfully subdued wedding, more like a funeral to me. The man professed to have no relations and apparently had scarcely any friends or business acquaintances. He was an agent for something or other and had an office off Holborn. I suppose he made a living out of it then, although we knew practically nothing of his private affairs. But I gather that it has been going down since, and I suspect that for the past few years they have been getting along almost entirely on Millicent's little income. Would you like the particulars of that?" "Please," assented Carrados. "When our father died about 7 years ago he left £3,000. It was invested in Canadian stock and brought in a little over 100 a year. By his will my mother was to have the income of that for life, and on her death it was to pass to Millicent, subject to the payment of a lump sum of £500 to me. But my father privately suggested to me that if I should have no particular use for the money at the time, he would propose my letting Millicent have the income of it until I did want it, as she would not be particularly well off. You see, Mr. Carrados, a great deal more had been spent on my education and advancement than on her. I had my pay, and of course I could look out for myself better than a girl could." "Quite so," agreed Carrados. "Therefore I did nothing about that," continued the lieutenant. 3 years ago I was over again, but I did not see much of them. They were living in lodgings. That was the only time since the marriage that I have seen them till last week. In the meantime our mother had died and Millicent had been receiving her income. She wrote me several letters at the time. Otherwise we did not correspond much. But about a year ago she sent me their new address, Brookbend Cottage. Mulling Common, a house that they had taken. When I got 2 months' leave I invited myself there as a matter of course, fully expecting to stay most of my time with them. But I made an excuse to get away after a week. The place was dismal and unendurable, the whole life and atmosphere indescribably depressing." He looked round with an instinct of caution, leant forward earnestly, and dropped his voice. "Mr. Carrados, it is my absolute conviction that Creake is only waiting for a favourable opportunity to murder Millicent." "Go on," said Carrados quietly. "A week of the depressing surroundings of Brookbend Cottage would not alone convince you of that, Mr. Hollyer." "I'm not so sure," declared Hollyer doubtfully. "There was a feeling of suspicion and, before me, polite hatred that would have gone a good way towards it. All the same, there was something more definite. Millicent told me this the day after I went there. There is no doubt that a few months ago Creake deliberately planned to poison her with some weed killer. She told me of the circumstances in a rather distressed moment, but afterwards she refused to speak of it again, even weakly denied it, and as a matter of fact it was with the greatest difficulty that I could get her at any time to talk about her husband or his affairs. The gist of it was that she had the strongest suspicion that Creake doctored a bottle of stout which he expected she would drink for her supper when she was alone. The weed killer, properly labelled, but also in a beer bottle, was kept with other miscellaneous liquids in the same cupboard as the beer, but on a high shelf. When he found that it had miscarried, he poured away the mixture, washed out the bottle, and put in the dregs from another. There was no doubt in my mind that if he had come back and found Millicent dead or dying, he would have contrived it to appear that she had made a mistake in the dark and drunk some of the poison before she found out." "Yes," assented Carrados. "The open way, the safe way." "You must understand that they live in a very small style, Mr. Carrados, and Millicent is almost entirely in the man's power. The only servant they have is a woman who comes in for a few hours each day. The house is lonely and secluded. Creake is sometimes away for days and nights at a time. And Millicent, either through pride or indifference, seemed to have dropped off all her old friends and to have made no others. He might poison her, bury the body in the garden, and be 1,000 miles away before anyone began even to inquire about her. What am I to do, Mr. Carrados?" "He is less likely to try poison than some other means now," pondered Carrados. "That having failed, his wife will always be on her guard. He may know, or at least suspect, that others know. No, the common sense precaution would be for your sister to leave the man, Mr. Hollyer. She will not?" "No," admitted Hollyer, "she will not. I at once urged that." The young man struggled with some hesitation for a moment, and then blurted out: "The fact is, Mr. Carrados, I don't understand Millicent. She's not the girl she was. She hates Creake and treats him with a silent contempt that eats into their lives like acid. And yet she is so jealous of him that she will let nothing short of death part them. It is a horrible life they lead. I stood it for a week, and I must say, much as I dislike my brother-in-law, that he has something to put up with. If only he got into a passion like a man and killed her, it wouldn't be altogether incomprehensible." "That does not concern us," said Carrados. "In a game of this kind one has to take sides, and we have taken ours. It remains for us to see that our side wins. You mentioned jealousy, Mr. Hollyer. Have you any idea whether Mrs. Creake has real ground for it?" "I should have told you that," replied Lieutenant Hollyer. "I happened to strike up with a newspaper man whose office is in the same block as Creake's. When I mentioned the name he grinned. 'Creake,' he said. 'Oh, he's the man with the romantic typist, isn't he?' 'Well, he's my brother-in-law,' I replied. 'What about the typist?' Then the chap shut up like a knife. 'No, no,' he said, 'I didn't know he was married. I don't want to get mixed up in anything of that sort. I only said that he had a typist. Well, what of that? So have we. So has everyone.' There was nothing more to be got out of him. But the remark and the grin meant, well, about as usual, Mr. Carrados."